Hello, and welcome to another episode of Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folktales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I am your host, Annabelle Bananabelle. It is another day here on planet Earth. We're all doing our best. We're all trying to stay in high spirits as we watch the patriarchy seemingly ruin everything. And I'm over it. I'm over it. Hot take. Our greatest ambition should be relaxation, fun, and symbiosis. There is no reason why any of us need to be working 9 to 5s in the same sense that we have now. We could all be planting gardens and forests and living in tune with the seasons. It's really not that hard. Sorry about it. Sorry about it. Sometimes I just feel like a little loop-de-loop. Well, today I'm very excited. Today we are going to talk about the legend of Inanna's descent into the underworld and the legend of Persephone and her descent into the underworld. How are they similar? How are they different? What do these stories mean? What are they getting at? Also, I want to have an honorable mention to a fan of the podcast who reached out to me. Actually, wait, let me get my phone. I wanna shout them out properly. Okay, here we go. Have my phone out. We're gonna go into my email. I got the cutest email of all time. It like made me cry. I read it in the grocery store. Where? Oh my God. I'm really dropping the ball right now. Okay, Tyler. Tyler reached out to me and is so sweet. They sent me the deleted scene from The Devils, which I had never seen before, and I'm so grateful for that. And they also sent me a picture of their pepper plant. And it is so super cute. And so I really just wanted to shout out Tyler and say thank you so much for writing in. I am just so tickled, and this is why I started this podcast. I wanted to make more friends. I wanted to connect with people who think about humanity from the terms of esotericism, ghosts, magic, folktales, freaky. I want to talk about the freaky shit. Come on, people. So that's your invitation. Send me an email. Just say hi. Tell me about some weird dream you had when you were a kid. Tell me about some weird cult that you heard about or your mom was a part of. Tell me something interesting, Speaking of which, this actually does remind me, not to go on a full-on tangent, a girl I was friends with she told me the story. So her family is from Berkeley, born and raised, and so her aunt went to Berkeley High back in the 70s. And when she was a freshman in high school, she started dating this grown man. Classic. Oh my God, classic. Dude, PSA, no, grown men should not be dating high schoolers. Anyway, she's dating this grown man. And he basically had started a cult, and it started getting more members joining. Obviously, this is the 70s. Everyone's doing a bunch of acid. Everyone doesn't need an excuse to just do acid in the woods or whatever. So she fully drops out of high school. She's 15, drops out of high school, goes and moves on this commune somewhere in NorCal with this guy. and becomes like the queen of this cult. And granted, I don't think she was like leading anything, but like she was like dating the guy who was the center of this cult. And apparently, like, after a few years, you know, as she was getting closer to 18, the glitz and glamour of the fantasy was kind of wearing off, because she was basically babysitting everyone's babies and kids as they were just getting super fucking ripped. Everyone was just tripping balls all day and fucking. And she was just like 17 babysitting a bunch of babies. And was like, this is fucking weird. Like, I'm not going to stay. And I just think that's such an iconic story. What an iconic story. Send me stories like that. I want to hear cool stories. I like hearing ghost stories. I want to hear anything, weird visions that you've had, premonitions that you've had, time traveling, astral projection. I don't know. Fairy tales that your grandma used to tell you. I don't know. You tell me. Write me an email. Send me a picture of your pepper plant. I want to be your friend. Also, I feel like maybe I should like raffle off t-shirts or something. Wouldn't that be fun? Who doesn't love a free shirt? Maybe like the first 10 people who write me an email, I'll draw names and send you a free shirt. I should send Tyler a shirt. Tyler, I'm going to send you a shirt. I'll email you later. Okay, without further ado, let's get into the business, baby girl. Let's get into the business. We are going to get into the descent and the return. Inanna, Persephone, the sacred feminine rites of death and rebirth. And I want to open with this question. How have our modern perceptions of the underworld tainted our ability to decode ancient symbolism? What if the darkest place you could go wasn't a punishment, but a rite of passage? Today's episode, we're diving deep into the ancient myths of two powerful goddesses, Inanna and Persephone. One descends into the underworld, shedding her power layer by layer, and the other descends into the underworld, surrenders, and eats the fruits of the dead. These myths are not only stories, but they are blueprints for ancient rites and feminine initiation. Stories and symbols that tackle grief and the nature of rebirth. And I'm so fucking excited about it. I just love women. I just want to take a second and say I love women. Women are incredible. Thank you so much, women. Love you, women. Love you. Okay, so let's start with Inanna. Shout out to a previous episode. There is an episode of my podcast that is all about Isis. And Inanna is one of the more ancient incarnations of the goddess of love and war. It's kind of like this symbol of fertility, love, and a little bit of blood. And so she has many names. So it is thought to believe that Inanna is also an kind of like the ancient version of Isis / Ishtar. But of course, as local mythology often goes, there can be local beliefs and ideals that maybe are based off of the stars or the planets or certain natural occurring elements in that area. And as time goes on and as humans interact with each other, it is very common for mythos and stories to start merging. So Inanna is one of the oldest recorded goddesses. According to our modern historians, she was a goddess of the ancient Mesopotamian culture. Inanna is considered one of the most important deities in ancient Sumer. And again, a little refresher that ancient Sumeria is now, well, I feel like I'm saying that weird. Ancient Sumeria, or Sumer, right? Do you say, I feel like you say Sumeria, right? Yeah. Ancient Sumeria is located in what is now considered modern day Iraq. So some of the earliest recordings of Inanna are from 4000 BC, which means it's like 6,000 years ago. That's quite a long time. She is associated with love, beauty, sex, justice, war, blood, aka my twin. And she's also known to hold immense cosmic power. A lot of modern day historians assume that Inanna is actually an allegory for the planet of Venus. And we're going to get into that in a bit. The story of Inanna's descent into the underworld represents a spiritual initiation, a sacred death and rebirth cycle. And this possibly could also be an allegory and or blueprint which would inspire a lot of like, quote, shamanic rituals that women would go through in the ancient world. Now, I feel like I'm a broken record, but I just have to say this again. I kind of can't stand the term shamanic. And obviously, English is a very... English is a very... I have a lot of problems with the language of English, mostly because English has been engineered as not only a colonizer language, but also a slave language. A lot of the words that we use in English don't reflect the root meaning and or, I'm kind of getting off track, but let's just talk about shamanic. The word shaman comes from a word saman, which was a recorded word from, I believe, Dutch travelers that were traveling through Mongolia and meeting with tribes of Mongolia and Russia. And in these tribes, they had seers, medicine men, whatever you want to call them. And their specific word for them was saman or something similar. And these Dutch travelers wrote it down as saman. And then as their papers were read, it became very common for people to start using this term as a blanket term for any culture that did any kind of spiritual rites. So I'm going to say it once, I'm going to say it again. I will never stop saying it. The word shaman and shamanic is a little bit reductive and frustrating for me. But take what you will from that. Take what you will. I mean, English, I feel like if we play this game, every word in English is basically the same story. So, maybe I'm just ice skating up a hill. So, one other aspect of our girl, Inanna, is that she is often associated with the moon and considered to be a lunar goddess. She embodies the waning moon and dark moon phases because she is associated with disappearance into the underworld. So let's get into the story, shall we? I'm going to burn some more Palo Santo because I really want to set the vibe. You should burn some Palo Santo with me. It just smells so good. It's like a blanket for your nostrils. Dude, it's just so good. Once I did mushrooms, and I think I had a whole pack of Palo Santo, and I just never stopped burning it. I burnt so much Palo Santo, and it was almost like I was smoking the Palo Santo. Oh my God, wow. Okay, let's get into it. So, preface. There are a few different versions of the story of Inanna. But we're going to be focusing on the Sumerian version. One, because it's the oldest. Two, because it's kind of like the most well documented. And just for simplicity's sake, we're just going to stick with this version. So, reminder that in the ancient Sumerian culture, the underworld was known as Kur. Kur. So, Kur was ruled by a goddess named Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal is actually the sister of Inanna. Okay? So, as the story goes, Inanna decides to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, who is the goddess of the underworld. The ancient texts never explicitly state why she is going. Some versions claim that her sister Ereshkigal was lonely and longed for company. Other versions say that perhaps their older sister died, which is why Inanna wants to go visit her sister, or perhaps even Ereshkigal's husband died. Regardless, Inanna decides to descend into the underworld to visit her sister. Before leaving, Inanna instructs her minister and her servant, who's named Ninshubur, to plead with the deities Enlil, Nanna, An, and Enki to rescue her if she does not return after 3 days. Now, all of these are like really famous Anunnaki who are both the quote-unquote gods of the ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian religions, and they are also the notorious aliens. So Enlil and Enki are brothers, and Nanna and An are the parents of them. So this is kind of like the pantheon, if you will. So Inanna tells her servant that if I don't come back in 3 days, you're going to tell the highest ranking people of our kingdom, the highest ranking gods, to come get me after 3 days, just in case. Insurance policy, we love that. The laws of the underworld dictated that with the exception of appointed messengers, anyone who is to enter the underworld may never leave it. So Inanna prepares for her descent, and she dresses elaborately for her visit with her sister. She puts on a turban, she wears a wig, she wears a necklace of lapis lazuli, and she wears a bunch of beads, and she wears what is known as a pala dress, which is a garment of high status. She wears mascara, and she wears a golden ring, and she carries a scepter of lapis lazuli. Oh my God, this outfit is a 10 out of 10. So, Inanna proceeds to the gates of the underworld, and she knocks. She demands to be let in. The gatekeeper, who is named Neti, asks her why she has come. Inanna tells them that she wishes to attend the funeral of Gugalana, who is the husband of her sister Ereshkigal. So, the servant Neti goes and reports to the goddess of the underworld herself, Ereshkigal. And in response, she tells him, bolt the 7 gates of the underworld. And then, one by one, open each gate just a crack and let Inanna enter. However, as she enters, have her remove her royal garments one by one. So, oh my God, this is so good. Actually, before we get into it, let's take a quick break. Hello, traveler. Have you forgotten that you are an incredible, one-of-a-kind pepper? There is no one on planet Earth like you. Do you know how incredible that is? Never forget it. It might take time. It might take practice, but whatever your dreams are, you can attain them. Yes, you can, and you know that it's true. I believe in you. I'm so proud of you. One step at a time, and you're gonna make it. Oh yeah, baby, just as the story is getting good. So, Inanna is now at the first gate and like peeling away armor to her core self, as if she's stripping away her ego, identity, and status. She is instructed one by one to remove a piece of her clothing. It's like strip poker. So at the first gate, she is told to give in her scepter of lapis lazuli. Interestingly, though, some versions say that she actually gives up her crown. But I do think that regardless if it's a crown or a scepter, I actually think that it's an allegory for the crown chakra. It's a symbol of like your nobility and like this it's stripping you away, right? Okay, so gate number 1, she gives up her crown and or her scepter of lapis lazuli. She's giving up her symbol of divine authority and connection to the heavens. She is surrendering her celestial identity. Then at the second gate, Neti instructs her to give up her royal necklace, the symbol of her status and power. You can also think about this as being her third eye chakra. Then she is instructed at the third gate to give up her double strand of beads and her breastplate, the protection over her heart tied to her willpower and sexuality. Really kind of like giving up the vulnerability of heart and desire, which could be the throat chakra. Then we have the breast pins. And tell me why, like when I read breast pins, I thought of nipple piercings. But most likely, I think a breast pin are like metal appendages that you would use to like clasp your dress closed or like your robes closed, like some kind of giant safety pin type of idea. By giving up her breast pins, she's giving up the closure of her clothing, the release of vanity and attachment to our personal appearance. And you could consider that to be the heart chakra. Then finally, she gives up her belt of lapis lazuli, which would be the solar plexus chakra. This would be the symbol of fertility, authority over life and death, surrendering the reproductive and creative control. Then at the sixth gate, she gives up her bracelets, which I think is very interesting. I'm superimposing this chakra analogy over this, right? But I would think of something different, but the arms are kind of your tools of autonomy. So I do think that it's interesting that those are second to last. By giving up her bracelets at the sixth gate, which in my analogy would be the second chakra, these are the adornments of status, strength, magic. This would be giving up and yielding of personal power and magic. I guess, though, it does make me think, because the second chakra does have a lot to do with your relation to others. And in Indian culture, for example, bangles are a symbol of marriage. So instead of a wedding ring, you would wear a bindi and your bangles to symbolize marriage. So maybe that really does kind of tie in very nicely. And then lastly, at the seventh gate, the last thing that Inanna had to give up was her robe, her actual clothes, which would also be an allegory for her identity, her nobility in general, her final layer of power, prestige, and identity, a complete ego death. And with that, Inanna enters the underworld completely naked, symbolically reborn, as nothing, as no one. So, once inside the seven gates, Ereshkigal, who is her sister of darkness, judges her and strikes her dead. And she is then hung on a hook. The corpse of Inanna is hung from a hook. That's fucking brutal. So, of course, if you remember, Inanna had told her servant, Ninshubar, to wait 3 days and 3 nights, and if they hadn't heard from her, to go seek help. Remember that? Remember that caveat? Well, Ninchubar is loyal. And Ninchubar waited for 3 days and 3 nights to pass. And sure enough, no sign from Inanna. So Ninchubar goes to the temples of Enlil, of Nana, of An, and Enki. And he pleads with each of them to rescue Inanna. No one gives a fuck. But Enki decides to help. He's deeply troubled. And he decides to help dear Inanna, which checks out. We fucking love Enki. Enki's hella lit. Enki is most likely what we consider to be Capricorn. He is like a mad scientist character. He lives under the ocean. He is the member of the Anunnaki who most likely molded humans out of clay, aka out of like natural material. So anyway, so Enki decides to help. And he creates 2 sexless, or I guess like non-gender conforming beings. They're almost like little fairy creatures. And he names them Galatura and Kurjara. And he molds their bodies from the dirt from underneath his fingernails. What? Like, how fun is that? See, Enki is so much fun. Like, yeah, let's help Inanna. I'm going to just take dirt from my fingernails and make little fairies. Like, yes, this is the kind of content I want. Write in about content like this. Okay, so Enki instructs the 2 little fairies, Galatura and Kurjara, to appease Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. And when she eventually asks them what they want, they are to ask for the corpse of Inanna. And after they get her corpse, they must sprinkle her body with the food and water of life. When they come, eventually when the 2 fairies make it to the underworld, they come before Ereshkigal. And allegedly, the story goes that she is in agony, almost like a woman giving birth. She's just besides herself. And she just tells them that they can have whatever they want. She doesn't really care. And she even says that they can have the life-giving rivers of water and fields of grain if they can relieve her of her pain. But they refuse all of her offers because the only thing they seek is the corpse of Inanna. So the 2 little fairies, Galatura and Kurjara, sprinkle Inanna's corpse with the food and water of life, and they revive her. And that was how Inanna was resurrected from death and eventually was able to leave the underworld, a feat that almost no one was able to do before then or possibly after. What's interesting about the story is I feel like a lot of the stories that we often think about or cite about the underworld kind of revolve more from like a Christian perspective, and it's always like a man, right? It's always like a man who goes to the underworld and sees like the darkest parts of himself, or like the devil and like pain and suffering. And what I find so fascinating about this story, which is one of the older stories on the planet, is how different it is from a lot of these more typical stories that we often think about, like Dante's Inferno, for example, or even themes in the story of Faust. And what I like so much about this story is how the underworld itself isn't like hell. And I really kind of see it as an allegory of like the sisters being different hemispheres of each other, like a yin and the yang. And to go into the underworld, which is like the yin, right? The darkness, the passivity, almost like the nothingness. Inanna had to become nothingness. She had to surrender and she had to die. And this actually kind of reminds me of the tarot, because she is eventually hung from a hook, right? And in the tarot, the number 11 is the hanged man. And it's all about conscious surrender, consciously surrendering everything, letting go, and like literally hanging yourself upside down. And by doing so, you see like a completely new perspective on reality in the world. And you're also like relinquishing all of your autonomy. Like you're using your autonomy to let go of your autonomy, which eventually leads to, the hangman is number 12, I'm so sorry. And after the hangman comes 13, which is death, which is really actually transformation, because after death becomes a rebirth, temperance. And to me, this story is very that. It's very like hanged man into death. So one thing that's interesting, there's not a lot of like recorded history on specific spiritual rites and or ceremonies that people were doing, mostly just because a lot of it wasn't necessarily written down. But a lot of historians believe that these stories were like a blueprint and almost copied during spiritual initiation rites, specifically for women. And it was possible that priestesses would practice these rituals and enter trance states, and very possibly like would go into underground temples and kind of like reenact this story. It also really kind of revolves around humility and stripping yourself from titles and lavishness to really get to the meat of who you are, like without ego and full vulnerability. It also really kind of touches on shadow work, right? Like, this is her sister. It's not like she's evil. It's that her sister's like a piece of her. She lives in the darkness. And like the other thing I think is so interesting too is like they're starting to discover so many more underground cities all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. And so like, what if this also was a story about like during the colder times of year going to live underground? Like, what if they lived above ground in the summer and in the winter time went below ground? And the winter time when you would live below ground was about like humility, shedding yourself from whatever wealth that summer brought you. And in winter, all are equalized, all are equal and living underground, right? That's just my hot take. Obviously, a lot of historians really just associate this with being an allegory for the seasons and why the seasons change. The the other thing that a lot of historians associate this with is sacred sexual rituals, and how that was also kind of tied into death and rebirth, and that sex itself could be a part of this ritual. So theoretically, like if they were doing a ceremony or ritual about Inanna and her descent into the underworld, perhaps sex would be involved because it is like a death and a rebirth. Again, take that with a grain of salt. Who knows who these historians are and what their ideas are, but I do love hearing about all these ideas, and I believe it. I mean, any culture, anywhere, if you have a holiday, people are fucking, right? What I find really interesting, though, is that modern astrologers recognize the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld as a reference to an astronomical phenomenon associated with the retrograde of Venus. 7 days before Venus retrograde makes its quote-unquote inferior conjunction with the sun, Venus disappears from the evening sky. The 7-day period between this disappearance and the conjunction itself is seen as the astronomical phenomenon in which the myth of the descent was based. After the conjunction, 7 more days elapse before Venus appears as the morning star, corresponding to the ascent from the underworld. Like what? That's the other thing. Like, that's where mythology gets so wild and interesting to me. Like, they could just be allegories for ideas and concepts, but they could also just be allegories for the planets and how they move through the sky. There's just so much. So that kind of brings me to the story of Persephone. I mean, how could you not think about Persephone when you're hearing this story? There are so many similarities, and it almost feels like the story of Persephone is kind of like a Inanna 2.0. Like they borrowed the story and just kind of tweaked a few things, right? Am I crazy? I feel like they did. It's just so good. Let's take a quick break. Hey, little Pepper. This is Annabelle here, reporting live from Pepper World HQ. If you enjoy the podcast, it would help so much if you could follow me. You could write a comment, give me 5 stars perhaps. Also, I would love to hear from you. Email in at esotericaandnonsense@gmail.com. I'd love to hear about your stories. I'd love to hear about suggestions. I would love to hear about any kind of weird, freaky thing that comes to your mind. Also, if you would like to support my podcast, you can follow me on Patreon. It's patreon.com/esotericaandnonsense. I will also have a YouTube page coming at you so soon. And I also sell merch. You can look up my merch. It's in the show notes for every single episode, as well as the show notes for my show. I appreciate you so much. I made this podcast to connect with cool, freaky people like you. So thank you so much. And we're back, baby boy. So, the story of Persephone, you may have heard it. It's a classic. It is a Greek myth. And in a nutshell, Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter, Demeter is the goddess of grain, of harvest, of fertility. So Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, is also kind of referred to as a kor or kore, a maiden. The peppers. The peppers are at it again. Honestly, we love them. We welcome the peppers here on the podcast. They're autonomous. They do whatever the fuck they want. And they may bark when they will. So, Persephone is known as a maiden. And she spends her days picking flowers. Often, interestingly, she's known to pick narcissus flowers, which are flowers associated with the word narcissist. We should tell that story another time. Okay, so one day as Persephone was picking flowers, the earth opened up and Hades abducted Persephone into the underworld. Interestingly, the act was sanctioned by Zeus, which kind of adds this like layer of like patriarchal oppression and like control over femininity. But anyway, so Demeter is distraught. Demeter wanders the earth for 9 days, holding a torch. She refuses to eat and she refuses to sleep. She's on a full-on strike. She eventually learns of the betrayal that Hades was the one that ended up taking Persephone, and she demands for her daughter to be returned. She decides to withhold fertility from the planet. No crops grow. A famine begins. So, in the underworld, Persephone decides to give in. So she eats food of the underworld. She eats 6 pomegranate seeds, and this binds her to the underworld. By ingesting food of the underworld, she is bound there. One thing I think is interesting, though, just to like bring up the story of Inanna. Inanna was dead and then was given the food of life, whereas in this story, she eats the pomegranate in the underworld and then like becomes a part of the underworld. Interesting. So, after all of this, Hades strikes a deal with Demeter to bring peace and balance back to the living world. He allows for Persephone to go leave the underworld for half of the year and to live with her mother. And then for the other half of the year to come back to the underworld and be the wife of Hades. And so in this myth, this is what explains the changing of the season. The winter would be the grieving of Demeter, missing her daughter and basically going on strike, only for Persephone to be let out of the underworld for spring and summer to begin. So before we go into like my deep like comparison and analysis, I do want to talk about the pomegranate part, because obviously this is like a really big part of this story. And I did some research on like some of the ancient and cultural context of really like what a pomegranate meant in the ancient world. So, and I actually have a theory. I have a theory that the food of life from the Inanna story could have referred to a pomegranate. And I'll tell you why. So, first and foremost, the pomegranate actually comes from Iran and northern India, okay? And it is very possibly one of the first domesticated trees. It was domesticated as early as the 5th millennium BC, so that's over 7,000 years ago. And yeah, so like I'm just saying, it's possibly the first ever domesticated tree. And in the ancient world, it was considered often a fruit of heaven and a great luxury. In ancient Iran, it was believed that pomegranates grew from places where the blood of Siavash had been spilled. Siavash was a man and or demigod who was known for being an innocent and having like a pure spirit. So it is believed that like pomegranates grew from places where he had spilled blood. So I just think that's really interesting, right? Like that would kind of make it a fruit of life if it's like springing from blood. Obviously, as far as the ancient world, as far back as the ancient world, pomegranates have been associated with blood, they've been associated with fertility, and they've been associated with life. What I also find really interesting is that in the ancient world, specifically in ancient Sumeria, the leaves of the pomegranates were used in fire temples during ceremonies, and the fruit was often eaten during weddings to ensure a healthy future and family. Also, there was a famous holiday known as Yalda, which was a ceremony at night in ancient Iran. And this was basically the winter solstice. People would eat pomegranates to celebrate the victory of light over darkness. Like, is this not reminding you of the story of Inanna/Persephone? What if the food of life was in fact a pomegranate? And like, what if the story of Persephone is just the same story retold slightly differently, right? Just saying. Okay. The other thing I found really interesting as well is that in ancient Greece, some believed that the pomegranate was actually the fruit of the dead. And they also believed that pomegranates grew from places where Adonis had shed blood. Right? Isn't this weird? I just find this stuff so interesting. I find this stuff so interesting. Especially just like the idea of life and death. I have this like thought. I think about this a lot. Like the idea, basically our modern ideas of death can change how we interpret ancient symbology and storytelling. And I guess this is true for everything. Our modern beliefs shape our reality, and I think it makes it hard for us to interpret ancient stories. Even if like word for word is literally translated, we might not understand the context, right? So like, for example, in ancient Greece, if they consider pomegranates to be the fruit of the dead, what if it's actually about like blood and blood bringing rebirth? And so it's like about death and rebirth. You know what I'm saying? The reason why I think about this is because I remember when I was in India and I was learning about Shiva, and I was like, I like loved learning about Shiva, but I was taken aback by how their interpretation of death and destruction was so much different than ours. Like Shiva is like a really like the god of rebirth, but they don't say that. He's like the god of death and destruction, but it's actually like a gift and a natural part of the cycle, and really the destruction is the rebirth. And I always thought that was so interesting, because obviously, like, when I hear death and destruction, my mind kind of like immediately assumes that they're like not nice, or like an asshole, or like a symbol of evil, right? But no, not at all. Like, Shiva is actually like incredibly patient and gentle and kind. And Shiva smokes weed, because it's like such a great burden to have to be the god of destruction. So he smokes weed to like stay relaxed. Like, what? And so anyway, my point is, like, I think about this a lot when I'm hearing ancient stories and folk tales and myths, because even if we're getting information that's accurate, our interpretation of that information could be inaccurate, right? So, another fun fact about pomegranates is that, according to some Jewish scholars, the pomegranate was the original forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. Now, I don't really know a lot about like Aramaic and or like the Hebrew language, but I do know that in like the word pomegranate basically means like apple grenade. Palm means apple, and like granada means grenade. So pomegranate kind of means like an explosive apple. And so my point is, like, who's to say how they originally translated the original scriptures, because perhaps they could have been referring to a pomegranate. Perhaps not, perhaps it was an apple. Who am I to say? But I do think it's interesting that some scholars believe that. Another interesting fact about pomegranates is that in the Book of Kings, in the Bible, they describe 2 pillars in front of the Temple of Solomon. And in these 2 pillars, they were both engraved with pomegranates. And it is said that King Solomon had his crown designed to look like the little crown on top of a pomegranate. How cute is that? I just love that. So, really, in my opinion, it really does seem like the story of Persephone is directly derivative of the story of Inanna. It really does kind of sound like this is the same story that's just kind of taken slightly different twists and turns, with maybe different takeaways or like different additives. But I see a lot of similarities here. The idea of, in the story of Inanna, these 2 sisters who are different versions of each other, kind of like a yin and a yang. Whereas in Persephone's case, it's about her and her mother, which is also 2 pieces of the same whole, reflections of each other. And it's really about them coming together and being together and kind of like fusing as one, while also being separate parts. I feel like this is like a yin and yang story. Okay, so this brings us to the Eleusinian mysteries. These were the sacred rites and spiritual rites practiced around the mythos of Persephone. So these ceremonies were held annually in Eleusis near Athens, and this was like a thing for over 1,000 years. So people would travel to Eleusis, and both men and women would come, both Greek people and foreigners. And the only rules was that they had to speak Greek and that they were not murderers, which I guess are fine rules. And this was known to be an extremely secretive ceremony. People were forbidden from revealing details of the ceremonies, and it is alleged that people would be killed if they violated these rules. It is most likely that big parts of their ceremonies included ritual fasting and purification, probably like vomiting. If they mean purification, they probably mean like vomiting. Torch-lit processions. They may have done reenactments of the descent and return of Persephone, and the ritual use of a psychoactive barley drink known as kykeon, which is kind of interesting because I know that acid is derived from mold that grows on wheat. So if this is a psychoactive drug and it's derived from barley, I'm assuming that this may have like some kind of acid effect. So people are basically fucking dropping acid. It's sick as fuck. Really, it is thought that these ceremonies were really like a symbolic death experience, and people would have visions of rebirth and or the afterlife, and their goal was really to spiritually transform and perhaps obtain immortality. Sadly, there isn't a lot of information on the Eleusinian mysteries, and that's kind of why they're called the Eleusinian mysteries. These were highly secretive events, but I guess what's like so exciting to me about them is that they revolve around a woman's journey into the underworld. There's something about this that feels very like magical and sacred, you know, like you meet with a group of people and do a lot of drugs to visit the underworld and come back. Like that's kind of beautiful. I love that. Another kind of festival, which is not quite the same, but honorable mention, was known as the Thesmorphia. And this was a 3-day fertility festival held exclusively for women. Sign me up. This festival honored Demeter and Persephone as bringers of fertility. They would often bury old dead piglets and would offer phallic objects in underground pits as a symbol of both decay and rebirth, like kind of like re-fertilizing old dead things. They would often also engage in ritual fasting, group grieving sessions, and celebratory feasts. And this 3-day festival served as initiation rites for married women and priestesses. How beautiful is that? That's actually so beautiful. I want to do something like this. Ultimately, what these two stories have in common, though, which I really find so interesting, is this concept of the feminine descent into the darkness. And it's really not into death, but actually into transfiguration and transformation. And in my mind, I feel like the pomegranate kind of exists in both stories. But really, like, the pomegranate for Persephone was completely like relenting, like giving up, I don't want to say giving up, but like relaxing and accepting her fate, like being in the underworld. And for Inanna, her removing her robe was a similar initiation. She let go of all of her earthly possessions and entered the underworld naked and accepted her fate. And she did die, obviously, before she was resurrected. However, what is important to notice is that both of them made these choices with autonomy. They both decided to accept their fate in the underworld, and that was a choice they both consciously made. And this led to their transformation. And for me, this does really kind of ring a bell. This sounds like the Hanged Man from the tarot. It really does. It really, really does. Obviously, like, one thing I also want to think about too is just like these cycles of the seasons really do relate with the cycles of the moon, menstrual cycles, and like really just how rooted in femininity all of these cycles are. Regardless if these are like literal stories or allegories, they are rooted in the idea of femininity, fertility, change, cycles. And I also think it has a lot to do with like mourning, like grief. It seems like a big part of these stories do revolve around grief. And that grief is a part of this cycle of fertility. It is a part of the death cycle. And it is a part of the birth cycle. And I do think that's really interesting that both of these stories do involve grief. Because if you remember, Inanna's sister was beside herself when those two fairies came down to retrieve her body. And of course, Demeter was devastated. And what if the afterlife or death was only a moment, like a winter, and there was an inevitable rebirth afterwards? I also feel like it's worth mentioning, and I think next week I'm going to do an episode focusing on Dante's Inferno and Faust. But from the stories I can think of, a lot of male-centered stories about descents into the underworld seem to have a lot more themes of regret and shame and punishment, and like layers of hell. And I do think that's really interesting because I see the descent into the underworld as like both a literal death, but also as like an allegorical death. And if you live with regret and shame for things that you've done, that is how you basically make extra work for yourself. Like when you die, you aren't ready to be reborn because you are still having to sort through and make amends for all of your earthly mistakes and really like live with your shame. Whereas in these stories, these women are able to give up everything, to let go, and therefore be reborn. So I do think that's something that is worth noting and something to think about. Because I think through the patriarchy, so many stories and aspects of spirituality that involved femininity have been erased. And this really isn't just about women in general. It's about the feminine quality within us all, which is the energy of fertility, the energy of creation. This is a quality that lives within all things. It's not really just about like gender, right? These are all like allegorical terms. And one thing that the patriarchy has done is condemn femininity and erase a lot of these stories. So I do think it's important for us to think about. I do think it's important for us to talk about and to really like break down the allegories of these stories and like what does it mean for you, for the creative side of you, the fertile side of you, the reflective side of you. What does it mean for that side of you to like completely let go of everything and to die and come back to life? Like, what does that look like, right? And that's kind of like what psychedelics are all about. Like if you've ever tripped balls, that's basically what happens. Like you become incredibly vulnerable. You have a little death and you're like reborn in such a special way. And it's not really about like power or ego or like how you perceive yourself. It's really just about like heart-centered and like very present awareness. So yeah, I mean, maybe this is a time for all of us to do some acid, meet with some friends, free bleed, and like lay on the earth and be reborn. That's kind of my takeaway. What's your takeaway? Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. It really helps if you follow my podcast, if you try to review it or comment. I really appreciate you. This podcast means a lot to me. These are the kinds of things that I used to think about privately and not share with anyone. And I still feel like I'm working up the courage every episode just to be able to speak freely. But life is too short and who fucking cares? I'm just going to share my ideas. And maybe you like them, maybe you don't, maybe some resonate, maybe some don't. Like, that's totally cool. I would love to hear your thoughts. And I just want to remind everyone that this life is one of many. And I really don't think we should take it too seriously. I think that life is supposed to be enjoyed and it's supposed to be fun. And I think if we can all do better at being kind to ourselves, it will be a lot easier to be kind to each other. And I do believe that it is possible, some way, somehow, for humanity to end its cycle of self-destruction and self-exploitation. It doesn't have to be this way. And with that, I will let you go. I'm sending you so much love. I'm sending you a hug. Bye for now. Over and out.